Well, we appreciate all of you taking the time to join us today. This effort started a few years ago with Clint Wyrick and myself having some conversations about potential wet meadow restoration. As many of you know, I think it's a very critical part of the state's landscapes that we're focused on conserving. And so as we started pulling other partners in, working lands for wildlife, and then the agencies here in Utah, we've kind of put this together. So hopefully we're hoping that this will kind of be a kickoff to start to see more of this Zeedyk work being done in the state. I think there's a ton of potential. Been involved with some of the BDA stuff, which works really good in some of our more perennial streams, but as we're looking at more ephemeral, some of our drier sites where we're still really concerned about wet meadows, creating mesic areas, kind of making that pie bigger. This is where this really come together. So again, there's a long list of people that have been involved over the last year to kind of get this up and running. Next. Some of the major presenters you heard from today is Sean Connor, who's been heavily involved in implementing a lot of the Zeedyk structures across the state. He's works for a consulting company called Biologic. Obviously, Jeremy Maestas, who has at least some ties back to Utah. That's where he started, I believe, part of his NRCS career. So it's always good to work with Jeremy. Jim Spencer, who NRCS out in the Una Basin, and then Quint Wyrick here with the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program have been integral and will be presenting most of the stuff today. Next. And then myself, Manny Hirsch, Hannah Nickenow, and Megan McGrath will be moderating and coordinating. We really appreciate the Intermountain West Joint Venture. They brought a lot of technical expertise to the table today to help this run smoothly, the registration, etc. So we're excited about this webinar and hope that you will all enjoy it as well. So walk you through the agenda really quick. It's broken up into 4 modules. Our hope today is to provide you with a solid kind of conceptual background of the purpose of Zeedyk structures, where they kind of came from, what they are. Then we're going to look at reading the landscape. As I've spent time looking into this and becoming more familiar, this becomes a critical piece in being able to put everything together and start thinking about how we can implement these Zeedyk structures for specific purposes. Then we'll spend some time in module 3 talking about the structures themselves and how they would function in a wet meadow or a mesic area situation. Okay, next. And then module 4, this is kind of bringing it all home. So where we should be working, what are our goals or objectives, prioritization, site selection. Whoops, we lost her. And then I think this is kind of, putting boots on the ground. And then importantly, I think one of the things that we've got some folks that have already started doing some Zeedyk type work in the state. And we've put a panel together because one of the things we hear about most often are the barriers to implementation. And so there's a whole lot of questions about, we're going to learn all about Zeedyks and how they work, but then the barriers to implementation, water rights issues, NEPA, those types of things. So again, strongly encourage you to use the Q&A. Then we'll also have a panel discussion after that 4th module. Again, this is a chance for you to, as you listen today and you hear and you're thinking about, okay, if I'm going to implement that, here's some things I'm concerned about in terms of limiting that may limit your ability to implement. This is the place to ask those questions. We've got quite a bit of experience with the crew on that panel. So that's the nutshell of our agenda today. Our first speaker will be Jeremy Maestas, and I will turn the time over to Jeremy.
Great. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. Well, thank you for that introduction, Megan and Eric. And I am super excited to be, quote, back in Utah, talking about this topic with a couple hundred of our close friends from different organizations. A little backstory on this work. Sean Connor and I have been teaming up with Mandy Hirsch at the Intermountain West Joint Venture and their team over the last 5 or 6 years, really trying to help empower communities around the West to expand their toolbox, think about other parts of the landscape that perhaps we get ignored that are really important to the overall picture of the productiveness and the resilience of the Western landscape. And so before we dive into all of the how-tos and demystifying, quote, these Zeedyk techniques, I always like to start with a little background on kind of why low tech and why would we want to do this. And the story I tell is any of you that have little toddlers know that pretty soon after they start talking, they start saying one word a lot, and that is why. And the reality is people don't really change. Even adults that we work with are going to sit there with their arms folded in their head asking, why should I care about this? Why should I do this? And so we're going to spend a few minutes this morning just giving you a little bit of the background on why we think this is important. Next. Simply put, in the West, water is life. It's not only critical to our fish and wildlife species, who over 80% of them depend on these riparian and meadow resources during some point during their life cycle, but it's the lifeblood of our rural communities. Ranching, agriculture, even our urban centers all depend on a resilient and reliable water source. Next. But to the trained eye, we can see signs of degradation written across the landscape. Valley bottoms that were once productive, lush, and green are now desiccated, dry, and just a remnant of their former selves. Next. Sometimes I think we learned most of what we needed to know by 5th grade, and then we spent the rest of our lives just forgetting it. Do you remember the water cycle? This is essentially what we're talking about making functional again. We need to take that limited amount of moisture that we get in the West, form of rain or snow, and put it to work. Keep it in soil moisture or groundwater as long as we can before sending it back out to the ocean or the atmosphere. Because when it hits that soil, that's where we get the magic of life happening. Next. So while we could, say that this is being done for lots of different reasons and lots of different goals, I'd like to encourage you to think about this shared vision for everyone, which is resilient landscapes. Taking degraded or incised meadow systems like the one on the left here and bringing them back, putting that soil to work as a sponge that captures that moisture when it comes during the spring runoff or winter season, and putting it to work, growing vegetation in functional floodplains. It builds that piggy bank up for those lean times later in the year. It serves as our natural storage, our reservoirs of productivity on the landscape. And we see that when we do that, we improve resilience, not only to drought, but also wildfire and flooding, as I'm sure some of you are experiencing this year. Next. When you Google the words stream restoration or meadow restoration, this is what you often see, right? A bunch of Tonka toys playing around in our streams or our meadows. Engineered structures and solutions has been the traditional approach to dealing with some of these problems, and it still is part of our toolbox. The problem is these approaches are very expensive and require a very specialized skill set to implement them. Next. But we need solutions that are scalable. This is a figure from my friend and colleague Joe Wheaton up there at Utah State University. Great resource for you all there in the state. A typical look at a watershed and the tributaries that make up an almond watershed scene. Note that most of those red lines are those upper headwater streams, many, many miles of small streams, wadable streams that you could literally walk across or jump over, that are places that need our attention and aren't places where we can just apply expensive fixes. It may or may not be appropriate to do that. And we don't have enough resources in the world to address the problem at scale. So next. So we've been looking over the last decade at broadening our toolbox to include low-tech approaches. And so by low-tech restoration, what we're talking about are approaches that are simple, cost-effective, can be efficiently scaled up. Structures, if we need them, are handcrafted using local materials, natural materials, with the goal of helping the system do the work. We don't want to babysit this forever. We want to kickstart the processes that make it healthy again. And hopefully we can allow broad audiences to participate. You won't need to have a specialized degree or tons of money to do this, just a willingness to learn and go through the planning process. Next. Low tech isn't a new concept. We've been dabbling in these techniques for centuries all around the world. Some examples from France, the early soil conservation efforts in the US. Forest Service published this in 1934, a guideline to watershed improvement that includes a lot of structures that we're going to talk about that look pretty similar to what we're doing today. Next. But there's a bit of a new twist with our new science and knowledge about putting low-tech structures to work in conjunction with natural processes that are needed to sustain these systems long-term. And so this term process-based restoration we'll use a lot in combination with what we're talking about here. And there's a couple of key design manuals and textbook resources that outline that for both our perennial systems and our ephemeral and intermittent systems that serve as the foundation for what we're going to be learning today. Next. So what processes shape streams and meadows? Well, of course, we've long recognized that hydrology, geology, geomorphology, the physical aspects of systems form the landscape around our valley bottoms. But there's been a growing recognition in the scientific literature over the last 10 or 15 years that's truly acknowledging that biology and ecology aren't just outcomes of physics, but they are an integral player in shaping what our streams and meadows look like. This has been described in the stream evolution triangle by Castro and Thorne. And then Bill Zeedyk's been talking about this for years in his quote trilogy that we'll refer to throughout the workshop. Hydrology, geomorphology, ecology, or biology, all working together to give you the form and function of these meadow systems. Next. So we'll be discussing these sticks and stones approaches, these techniques that can be implemented by all of you to help make those processes functional again, or kickstart them, mimic them, and hopefully promote and sustain them over time, which is the ultimate goal. Utah has a long history and is familiar largely with beaver dam analogs, post-assisted log structures due to the great work of Utah State University and the Wheaton Lab. But today we're going to help you grow that toolbox and address some of these other systems with the quote Zeedyk structures that really help address more of that meadow erosion issue. Next. We did some science on this a few years ago with some colleagues at the University of Montana and wanted to take a look at, what do we know about the efficacy of this low-tech work? So we examined 3 different project areas across the West that have been in place for a varying amount of time. The grazing management example there in Maggie Creek, BLM and permittees made some changes to their grazing management, which fostered riparian vegetation recovery and ultimately beavers coming back. We then looked at the beaver dam analog and low-tech work out in Bridge Creek, Oregon. And then finally went to Gunnison, Colorado, where they've been implementing these Zeedyk structures in their wet meadow systems for, just over 5 years now. And what we did was enlisted the help of satellites and looking at vegetation productivity through time, analyze, like, could we see this from space? Are we having enough of an impact that we could see the outcome of this work from space? And what we found was that across the board, these low-tech approaches increase productivity of the vegetation by 25%, and it kept plants greener longer in these meadows throughout the seasons. And a really interesting finding was that the longer these projects were on the ground, the more productivity really didn't depend on how much precipitation you got each year. In other words, the sponge filled up and it helped you buffer those ebbs and flows of precipitation from year to year. And so when you have a functioning meadow, you're better able to kind of dampen those interannual fluctuations in your production. Next slide. Of course, when we're talking about water, we need to take a kind of whole watershed view, because these things do all work together, from the headwater systems and the uplands on down to our main stems. But we're really going to focus most of our attention today on that kind of those upper headwater type meadows, springs, and seeps. We'll talk briefly about some of the connectivity with our perennial systems, but our real focus is on the meadows. Next. And we want to share with you, a lifetime's worth of lessons that we've picked up from Bill Zeedyk, who's the gentleman sitting on the head cut here in the middle of the photo, and help you read the landscape, think like water, recognize opportunities to address resource issues early before it's too far gone and is going to take a lot of resources to fix. And so that proactive aspect's a really key element of our strategy here today. Next. And most importantly, we want to empower you to be part of the solution. As I mentioned, with NRCS, our Working Lands for Wildlife effort, the joint venture, and Sean, we've been running around the West, working with communities and kind of a place-based problem-solving, mindset, where we have that collective will and those folks who are ready and interested in acting on this, helping stand up that confidence to implement this work on their own. And so today we're doing this in Utah, and we'll have some follow-up demonstration and hands-on work going on in the state. Next. As a final reminder here, the techniques we're going to talk about today, the low-tech restoration in meadows, is just one tool in your toolbox. We put together a campaign for our sage grouse initiative efforts several years ago called Water is Life, and identified a suite of things that we have in our arsenal to help ranchers and other producers address these resource concerns. And some of them are higher cost that we do on a more limited extent. And then there's this suite of other things that we could implement at really big scales. And that low tech work is one of those items in that bucket. So I just want to leave you with that, knowing that there are a bunch of other techniques out there that all work in tandem. And this is just going to hopefully enhance how you see the landscape and opportunities you recognize for improvement. So with that, Eric, I will turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Jeremy. It was really good. And again, we'll have time for some questions after we're done with the next couple of presentations. Next, we're going to hear from Jim Spencer and Clint Wyrick on the context for wet meadow restoration in Utah. Jim, go ahead.
Thank you, Eric. Welcome everybody to our presentation today, our workshop. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about what does this mean to Utah. So Jeremy's given us a really good overview of this low-tech wet meadow restoration across the West. But what does it mean to us? Here in this photograph, you see our former range con, Shane Green, contemplating the sticks and stones, what in restoration. What are we what are we talking about when Jeremy mentioned sticks and stones? So we'll go to the next slide, please, Megan. Okay, Utah has we know BDAs, we know sticks. So we've done a lot of things with sticks in the state. After all, we are the home state of Joe Wheaton and his PBR restoration, process-based restoration efforts. And so I'm sure every single one of you here has at least 1 or 2 pictures of a BDA similar to this one somewhere in your photo files. They seem to be ubiquitous, and folks are even doing them for other people now, and contractors are specializing in building these. And so we know how to build these. Next, please. What about the stones? So Utah has a long history of using stones in restoration. Sometimes those stones are placed in contrast or against natural processes. For instance, riprap kind of enters my mind, where we use a lot of riprap, and we armor up banks, and this works against these processes, these natural processes. It resists the change. It resists the forces that it creates streams and valley bottoms. And so, but there's some of them out there that do sort of resemble these other structures that will benefit or will work in tandem with our natural processes. Here in this lower left photograph is a structure that looks surprisingly like a One Rock Dam, a Zeedyk structure that was built in Kane County in approximately 2007, before we really kind of knew about One Rock dams. And then the larger version of that photograph is on the top right, where it probably took a track hoe to place those rocks. So still kind of expensive, large equipment, things that we had to do to make these stone structures work. So let's go to the next slide, please, Megan. So again, why is this important? Jeremy mentioned several of these items that are on this slide. So we have, of course, climate change coming at us, these extreme weather events. We just got out of several years of drought, of severe drought, and we topped it off with a 200+% snowpack this year. So we've got these giant fluctuations in weather that are creating havoc with some of our natural processes that may be somewhat impaired by disturbances further down. So another reason is this, Jeremy mentioned the low tech, we don't need it to trouble our engineer friends. We don't need to go and kind of wait in line to get a design. We can get out there now, and we can go out and build these structures and do these improvements in a relatively quick time frame with very low risk. If one of our One Rock Dam structures fails, we're not going to wipe out a village or an old folks home somewhere in Salt Lake City. We're going to lose about 5 rocks 10 feet down the swale that we can put back in about 30 minutes. So these are very low risk structures, and they're very effective, hand built, and it allows a whole array of people to participate, anywhere from from even school kids all the way up to our universities and even nonprofits, anyone, volunteers. Lots of different people can participate in this effort. And as Jeremy mentioned in his presentation, this increases land resiliency. This whole concept of low-tech structures is about increasing the land's resiliency, and resiliency to climate change is a big one. We know that we're getting these different weather events, and so we want to be able to build up the land's ability to absorb disturbance and absorb these great fluctuations in our weather, extreme weather events. And also, there are many opportunities where we can exploit these practices and do these things and try to heal the landscape of disturbances that may or may not be human caused. Okay, for now, we're gonna go and the next few slides, I'm gonna just address some of the opportunities that we may see in our own backyards. And we'll go to the next slide, please, Megan. So some of our wet meadows may be a little bit on the drier side. These mid-elevation meadows, like Jeremy pointed out, we're kind of pulling out of the lower valley bottoms and the streams and the higher order streams and features, and coming up into these headwater situations. That I want you to take notice of the photo on the bottom left of your screen. That little tiny head cut is probably about 3 inches tall, maybe 4. This is something that you would walk over without even tripping, and yet this has the potential to grow to a 4-foot head cut, and sometimes even in a single event, in a single heavy precipitation event. And so these are the low-hanging fruit. If anything, we want to be able to help you train your eye to notice these little tiny nicks or nick points or head cuts where we are starting to lose some soil and we have roots exposed. And those are the points that we want to be able to address first. It costs so much less. That little tiny 3-inch head cut could be a $1,000 bill laying on the ground. We could fix that in maybe 15 minutes with a little rock structure that would save us thousands and thousands of dollars down the line if we were to come back in after it was degraded down. So we have a little bit of drier ones, and let's go to the next slide, Megan. And just downhill from that last one is where the water is kind of seeping out of that sponge, and it's coming out where the gradient gets a little bit steeper. So here we have a wetter system, and we also have a different disturbance that came through here. There was a fire that took out a lot of the vegetation, and it caused some of this degradation, and as well as some hoof shear. And I was being teased by Sean on Monday that NRCS always thinks of hoof shear as elk work, not cattle work. So both elk and cattle, so wildlife and domestic livestock will produce this hoof shear and this erosive quality. So these are some places that we can focus some of our work as well. Next slide, please. Another spot that that we visited this last year up here on the Tabby Mountain wildlife management area. This is a really narrow spring-fed creek that has these wet meadows in the bottom of it, and the water doesn't move fast here. It will move faster if we get a high precipitation event, but normally it's just a slow trickle coming out of a spring. And I've almost, if you couple that slow trickle with disturbance, it's almost like giving the land a waterboard torture treatment. It slowly will chew away at those head cuts and erode it grain by grain, and that head cut will continue to advance upstream. And so these are some of the places that we can also focus our work. Next slide, please. Lastly, I would like to address maybe a unique Utah opportunity. This is something that I've been working with the Utah Geological Survey for, excuse me, for a couple of months now. We've been talking with Diane Manus and Pete Goodwin about where to work, about analyzing where we could focus efforts. And as you know, those who do know Diane and Pete, these folks are wetland folks. They deal with wetlands. And so a lot of these wet meadows that we are seeing have the criteria to meet wetland criteria. And so we aren't the only ones interested in wet meadows or these mesic areas, because they're also potentially wetlands that other agencies and different organizations will take jurisdiction over, that will claim them and will attempt to restore them as well. And so there's other eyes on these besides sagebrush rats and upland biologists as well. And so I want to talk a little bit more about a pilot project. Next slide, please. That Pete and Diane are working on. They approached me and others, and we talked about doing some sort of a pilot project as they update the national wetlands inventory mapping. as if anyone has worked with NWI mapping, as I was skeptical in the past, it was pretty generic and it didn't seem very accurate and complete. This photograph here shows two different mapping efforts. The 1984 one, which is most of the state of Utah was mapped with this in 1984. And then Diane and Pete and their crew are working on updating our NWI maps, making them a lot more accurate. They have better tools to be using now, using remotely sensed ground truth data with higher resolution and multi-year imagery, looking for these different wet areas and outlining those. So if we're ever curious or wondering where we can build our structures, maybe NWI is another tool to put in our toolbox that we can go to. It's a free service that Fish and Wildlife Service offers, and you can just go online and make your map. And if you have large tracts of land that you manage, for instance, the BLM, there's quite a few of the BLM people here today, or if there's a large ranch, private landowner, and you may see some of them are pretty obvious that you can see right from the roads. Some of them are kind of out there. They're out in the middle of nowhere, and we may not know there's even a problem. Pete and Diane are working on trying to focus down in and see how they can make the NWI mapping process, how they can make it more useful to wet meadow restoration to us that are going and doing this effort. And so they want to be able to pick up on things like vegetation vigor trends, drying trends, even incision. Sometimes they can even pick up incision when they use digital elevation models or different things. And they want to put this all into a clearinghouse in the NWI sections where we can go and find these data. And they're looking for help from you and from me and from others who are out on the landscape, help with ground truthing and help with maybe what we might need, what are our needs, so they can try and figure out how to put those into this product and to help us help ourselves and figure out how to find these degraded systems. And so if anybody gets a chance, contact our friends at Utah Geological Survey to be able to do this. And so if anything in my presentation, that if I want to emphasize anything, it's that don't be afraid to go out and do these and to out and look for these and practice these things. And it's not rocket science. It's pretty simple. And the training you'll receive today from Jeremy and from Sean will be what you need to be able to go out and just try these. And your first ones may look like a 2-year-old built them, like my first one. And it may only last one event, but you'll get better as it goes. And so with that, I will turn the time back to Eric.
Thanks, Jim. Again, if you have any questions, make sure you get them in the Q&A down at the bottom of your screen. So next we'll hear from Sean and Jeremy about reading the landscape recognized opportunities.
I think we're actually switching.
me.
Oh, sorry, Clint, my bad.
And Clint, have you been chatting me that you're having trouble with your slideshow? I think.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a lag sometimes, like to several seconds. So
Zoom,
anyway,
Zoom is telling me you have a different name, so I was like, oh, I feel bad for this guy, but there's not much I can do. So let me know if you're having trouble seeing the slides, Clint. I'm gonna let's just see how it goes.
All right. Okay. Well, I'm not even going to introduce myself. We did that, and we're just going to jump right into this and have a picture. So I hope you're all ready. My job was to kind of show everybody that there's project work being done, and my goal here is to show you a bunch of pictures, show you that we're doing it. We can do it. If I can do it, everybody can do it, and to just kind of stimulate ideas as you get out next time on the landscape. And next slide, please. So yeah, there's a little bit of a lag there, but I wanted to highlight this first project. It's one of the first few that we've undertaken. And Megan, you might need to try to read my mind sometimes, because that lag was probably 10, 12 seconds long. But
I think some of these
so
photos are really big,
kind
so
of
they're
go
lagging.
forward.
I'll read your mind.
Yeah, go forward, and I just got lots of photos, and as I talk, we'll go through them. But Yeah, this is a silver sagebrush site actually, and a lot of people, I think, in Utah, we come across these sites and we don't think of these as wet meadows because we're used to thinking of sagebrush as dry, but silver sage is an indicator of soil moisture. They're extremely high in herbaceous vegetation. And anyway, we have this head cut here, and we drove by it a few times, got out, started looking above it. We got a lot of meadow below it. Sagebrush has really crept in, and the sagebrush is even converting to like mountain sagebrush. Next slide, please. So we decided to attack this, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NRCS, Utah Watershed Restoration is kind of the funding sources. It was a kind of a two-part project. The first project, we hired Utah Conservation Corps crew. Second part was a private contractor. But here we have the UCC hauling rock on day one. They were enthusiastic and excited. They hadn't hauled much rock. I want to mention that we used rock on site here. It would be nearly impossible without a helicopter to fly to get rock on site. And we used rock from disturbed areas, and that eased the archaeology on us. We roadside and from cattle ponds is where we gathered rock. And so I wanted to point that out too. And UCC, never done it. So there's a lot of supervision on the project manager part. And if you can scroll through these slides, the project manager had to be there. We were teaching them. They've never done this. We had to correct them. We had to undo some of the structures that we built and redo them. But they got better as they went. And here they are at this head cut, and they're attacking this head cut. This is the very first structure that they did, and they built a Zuni Bowl here. And next slide, there's the end product. So pretty good. UCC had to be there to teach them. They did good. Okay, and then next slide, moving downstream, we had them build some other structures, and they got better as they went, and we ended up with a really good project. We had some hybrid structures they built. That's that first one there. A lot of one rock dams in some of these draws. And what's the next picture? A little bit of lag on me, but build a lot of structures here. So next slide, please. Second part of this project, we hired a private contractor who had experience, who's done a lot of this type of work. And we had them go out. They did some maintenance on some of that UCC project, but they also built us some new structures, and we just kind of expanded that project. Now, quality, experience costs money. It was a lot more expensive to hire the private contractor, but it was worth it. And contractor oversight was minimal. And what was really cool while they were there, they photographed a big monsoon rain event. If you scroll through these pictures, you'll see water running through our structures, and it was really neat to have that happen. And the contractor he's really good at documenting the process. And right now I just see one picture. If there's an aerial, if you can scroll, there will be an aerial picture showing some of our structures. And we ponded a lot of water, and we caught a lot of sediment in some of these structures just within an hour. It was pretty neat to see. So if you can get to the next slide, to the next project, this is where I say prioritize water. In Utah, a lot of times we don't think that we have water, and we do have water. We just, sometimes we go by it. I mean, I work on private lands. I've seen a ton of these springs, and these springs usually have some water flow, and then the water goes underground. So you can see here, spring water running down this trench, dry as hell. And we thought, well, let's use this water and let's bounce it around. So what we did, we wanted to get this water out of the trench. We hired a contractor through a competitive process, and they bid per structure. They've done lots of BDA work for us. They needed some time management. We needed to teach them. They wanted to start doing this wet meadows type stuff. If you can get to the next slide, if you're not there already, but there they are building some of the structures. And again, logistically, we use rock on site. I mean, it sucks to pay people to move rock, but sometimes you have to do it. We've done a lot of projects where we haul in rock, but where we ended up, I have a repeat photo. So next slide, please, is this project. We have a repeat exactly 1 year apart in October. And if y'all can see that, the arrow indicate, yeah, there we go. Sorry everybody if that lag is confusing you, but
I'm
yeah,
sorry,
1 year
too.
apart. That's all I mean, there's not much to say about that. That's pretty incredible. What bouncing a little water through there and ponding it up a little. Next slide, please. And then in this slide, the arrows indicating dead sagebrush. We've increased the wetted soil, and yeah, any landowner can get on board with killing sagebrush and increasing forage. So lastly, if you can scroll through these pictures, Megan, this is something I've looked at most recently. And I just want to say we've been working in this watershed for a lot of years in the uplands, and I've missed things. 13 years of driving by this spot that's tucked away. And if you just scroll through these pictures, but this is a project we're currently planning with USU, Division of Water Quality, Fish and Wildlife Service. You can see water's in a channel, and we need to get sheet flow back on this meadow. And what I wanted to say in closing is just look around, plan broader, expand your projects by treating other habitat types. Don't think scaling up your project just means acres. I mean, to me, scaling up means treating multiple habitat types. Don't just be reaching for acres. And that's what I've done here. Is I've tried to treat a lot of upland acres, and I've missed opportunity. Get out of the damn office if you're a planner, biologist, ecologist, coordinator, or whatever. If you don't get out, you'll miss it. See what's going on at different times of the year. Go back to your projects and see what you missed. And that's what I had to do here. And it took me many years to see what I missed. Wear out your truck tires. Supervisors, encourage your people to get out with no other reason than to observe. I've driven past this spot for 13 years and missed it. And then just a quote from Dave Rosgen. If anybody knows Dave Rosgen, he says, if you don't know Bankful, you don't know shit. I changed it to if you're only treating uplands and you're not treating your mesic areas, you're not doing shit. So with that, thanks everybody. And hopefully some of those pictures stimulated some ideas and help you look at the landscape next time you get out in Utah.